Hi, I'm Brian LaRosa, and welcome to my video tutorial of my Thomas & Friends Wooden Railway layout. Before I start this tutorial, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my fascination of Thomas & Friends. Now, I've been such a big fan of Thomas & Friends since I was a little kid, and because I'm such a big fan of this TV show, I've been playing with those wooden trains since I was a little kid, since they are based on the TV series. Up until 2010, it was located in my basement when we first moved to Damascus, Maryland. But later, my layout is transferred to the attic. Now, I'm gonna explain to you why it's located in the attic right now, later in this tutorial. I'm gonna explain to you some of the facts about Thomas & Friends. These TV series were based on the book series written by the Reverend W. Awdry, named the Railway Series. The Railway Series were first written probably in the 40s or so, until in 1984 the first series of Thomas & Friends was released on television. The series started off with the model trains and the sets and scenery and so forth. And one of the things I like about Thomas & Friends is that in the first series of Thomas & Friends, they were originally narrated by the same guy who was in the Beatles, named Ringo Starr. And so far, they produced the first 11 series of Thomas & Friends using the original models and sets and scenery and so forth up until 2008, and nowadays they were now converted into computer-generated imagery animation, or CGI. And I'm not such a really big fan of CGI animation because they use some more advanced effects like the moving faces, and it's pretty ugly and replaced the original model animation. So I like the model animation better. Okay, so now that I have told you a little story about my fascination with Thomas & Friends, let's go right ahead and start the tutorial. Moving up to the attic, here is my Thomas Wooden Railway layout. Now, I'm going to start with the roundhouse area. The roundhouse, here's the roundhouse, and then the roundhouse has 5 sheds, and it's where I keep the main characters of Thomas & Friends. You can see Thomas, Percy, Edward, Henry, Gordon, and James. And since the roundhouse has 5 sheds, I've fit Thomas and Percy in 1 shed. So that way I'll have 6 engines in 5 sheds. Now, in front of the shed, here's the turntable, and there you can see 3 lines. One goes into the yard area, the other one goes this way, and the third one is just a dead end. If we follow up this track, this leads into the yard area. Now, this section you see here, this is where I keep the freight cars. Accessories you see here are the soda oil depot and the water tower. Another section you see here is where I keep the coaches. Now you can see the track, the switch. Here are 2 ways this switch can lead to. This way goes to that track, and the other way goes all the way through the bridges. Now, if we follow up this track, here you can see this building, and I would use it as some sort of passenger station. And if we follow up this track, here's the train passes through the Sodor Bay bridges. Now I notice by the bridges you can see I have all the other engines in this section right here. I would use it as some sort of engine depot. From now on, let's continue on the tutorial. If we follow up this track, this leads into this switch right here. Now this switch leads to two ways again. Now this track leads back into the roundhouse area, and the other track goes through the elevated track. If we go through the elevated track, then this would end up right here. Now I'll get back to the elevated track later in this video. From now on, let's continue on this tutorial. Now if we follow up this track, here's this accessory you see. That's the stop and go station. And again, this goes back into the roundhouse area. But let's continue on this track. If we go through this track, you'll notice this switch right here, and this takes a shortcut to this track here. And here's another accessory you see. That's Toby's windmill. Now let's continue on a longer way there. If we follow up, here we're going through the mountain tunnel. Coming through the mountain tunnel, you'll notice in this section I've added some trees there. I'm going to use it as Henry's Force that was featured in the Thomas and Friends TV series. And there's one accessory here. That's the barrel loader. And here's another tunnel, a short tunnel, which goes into another switch. And then in this small building you see here, I'm going to use it as a switching building. And you can see two ways. This can go either this way or that way. Let's continue on up the mountain tunnel. If we go up the mountain, the train goes all the way down the mountain and goes into this track right here. And here's another building you see here. I'm going to use it as a passenger station. Now here's the switch that leads the shortcut to this track, as I showed you earlier. And there's another switch. This means it leads to the track that goes around the layout, and the other track goes into the elevated track. Now I'll get back to the elevated track in just a minute, but let's continue on this way. If we follow up the track, the train goes over the elevated track, going down the elevated track, and this leads into this track. Now the train can go. Now this switch you see, this leads back into the yard area, and this leads into the same track. So that's how the track goes around the layout. The accessories you see here. Here's the coal station, and there's Cranky the crane. Now let's continue on this track. If we go back up the mountain and going back down, and goes back in the same track, because again this track goes around the layout. Okay, so let's go up the elevated track. Now, as I said to you earlier, I transferred all the wooden pieces of my layout up to the attic. Now, the reason is because a couple years ago I received my first MTH train for Christmas, and so I transferred the layout up in the attic so I could have more space for my MTH train to run in the basement. Also in the basement I haven't constructed this elevated track yet, but I constructed that after they're transferred into the attic because I want to reduce the number of dead ends on my layout. Now, I've actually made a video about the elevated track. If you'd like to see this video, you can click on the link that's popping up on the screen. Anyway, let's continue on this tutorial. If we continue on the elevated track, we go all the way back into this section right here. Now, this goes through the middle section of the mountain tunnel, and we continue on this track. We go up the elevated track, through the bridge, and going down, which goes back into the same switch as I showed you earlier. So that about wraps it up for this tutorial. Now, I've actually made a video about my collection of wooden trains. If you'd like to see this video, you can click on the link that's popping up on the screen. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial of my Thomas Wooden Railway layout. I'm Brian LaRosa, and I'll see you next time.